Welcome back to the Onyx Report's Black Masculinist news feed. Question for the day. Is there currently a new deal being extended to black women? Not the black community, not black children, not the black poor, not the black homeless, black women. I start this with an article I found dealing with BLM, right? Black Lives Matter. We know this to be an organization that came about in roughly 2015 in response to black male death. And then of course they reached the the heights of their popularity, in regard to the death of Michael Brown and Ferguson. Now this is going to be key a little bit later, so stick with me. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing with BLM is a recent article that came out dealing with their funding and where they currently stand, right? This is a piece you can find on moguldom.com, moguldom.com, and it's entitled 10.6 billion was given to Black Lives Matter causes. Where did the money go, right? And it reads, following the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, the message Black Lives Matter appeared on signs at protests across the world. Streets were painted with the words, and they were one of the top searches on Google for 2020. Major corporations adopted the slogan to show their support in the fight to end injustice, and with all this exposure came mega donations to BLM, a grassroots group that popped up in 2013. Public support for the Black Lives Matter movement was at an unheard of 67% in June, according to Pew researchers. BLM-related causes pulled in more than 10.6 billion in donations, according to The Economist. Now, basically, that's not arguing that BLM as an organization got 10 million last year, or 10 billion, but you can't deny the beginning of the article. BLM was the name that people most associated with this movement. So they probably got a good portion of it. There's not been a whole lot of transparency until recently about how much they've gotten and how it was being used. But what I want to highlight here is that this is an organization that began in response and really bolstered itself off of black male deaths. This is also an organization that let people know very early on that black men would not hold any significant leadership positions because historically it was argued, based on intersectionality theory, that black men have been oppressive to black women and to black LGBTs, and therefore they needed to sit back and follow, right? So they couldn't be in leadership positions, but that had nothing to do with whether the organization would attract attention or appropriate causes that were rooted around black male deaths. And that's one of the things that we actually saw in Ferguson. Shout out to Nyota Uhuru and Mr. Darren Seals, the late Darren Seals, who exposed the way these organizations, or should I say BLM in particular, appropriated a grassroots movement in Ferguson. We all watched it happen on television. Those of us who couldn't go to Ferguson, we saw a local movement that was soon appropriated by people who had, migrated there. We heard the chants go from hands up, don't shoot to Black Lives Matter. Very few of us, really had issues with that. I mean, it just sounded like we moved from one chant to another. One moment people were doing die-ins, and the next moment, they were holding signs and shouting Black Lives Matter, shouting Black Lives Matter. So what? Didn't seem like a huge shift. But when Darren Seals and Nyota Uhuru began to break what was going on the ground, that you had this college-educated elite that came in and appropriated the movement on social media, and then began to attract attention and dollars, right? Donations that went to specific groups that were visible on social media in ways that the local Ferguson population couldn't keep up with. It had a ramification in terms of dollars received, and local organizations in Ferguson didn't really get to benefit from that. So let's continue. They, and even in this article, acknowledge not only how the deaths of Michael Brown kicked off everything, but the continued deaths of black men like George Floyd kicked it into the stratosphere, right? Well, you tell me, you seen any programs or policies passed specifically for black men since 2015 in any way that stemmed the number of deaths that black men suffer? Don't worry, I'll wait. Anyway, The Economist says, or I should say the article says, not much is known about how the money is being used. The organization's founders, three black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, have been accused of social media of not sharing a single cent with black people. Others came to BLM support, saying they are donating to BLM city chapters and trying to start a bank. I hope people don't believe BLM, the legal entity, received $10 billion. The Moguldom Nation founder, Jamarlin Martin, tweeted, the corporate confederacy defines BLM causes as they wish, right? As a diversity program. You can take issue with a group, but don't lie on them. The bougie buffer predictably got the George Floyd dollar. Now, this is interesting. He calls, and you can find, there's an article on Moguldom.com where they identify who they refer to as the bougie buffer class, right? Which traditionally has been a group of mostly mixed race descendants of white slave owners who were in a position of elitism in the black community and were primed to receive resources from white America and use them to kind of demonstrate that racism wasn't so bad. Black people were doing better than they actually were, even though they were a unique bourgeois buffer class. I simply argue that that buffer class notion has actually shifted in many ways, and whether they know it or not, whether they are supported or not, has been targeted to many black women. But let's continue. Another article that I add to this you can also find on apnews.com, and it's entitled Black Lives Matter opens up about its finances. Right, the foundation, widely seen as a steward of the Black Lives Matter movement, said it took in just over $90 million last year, according to Financial Snapshot shared exclusively with the Associated Press. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is now building infrastructure to catch up to the speed of its funding and plans to use its endowment to become known more than protest after black Americans die at the hands of police or vigilantes. Now you see this? See how they play with the language? Yes, there have been female deaths, but we know in terms of police homicide, there are about 200 to 300 black men per year that are killed and about 9 to 13 black women. This is not a black American deaths issue. It's not. It's murder, but most particularly of black men. And here you have a mostly black feminist organization that has made sure that men will not be in a position of leadership, but it will define an agenda using black male deaths to gain attention and resources and shifting the focus to primarily black female-led ventures. This is a problem because it means that not only have black male deaths been used by the state in various ways, they now are being used by black feminist organizations, or an organization in particular that's most well known since 2015 for its own purposes. See, this is why I referred to this as a form of gentrification when I talked about anti-black misandry, and I talked about, the various forms of it. The very last form that I did a show on last year in summer, I believe it was, I talked about the way in which this is a new form of gentrification, where you have resources from outside of the community being leveraged on behalf of a very specific demographic within the community, thus shifting the class dynamic and creating a new buffer class in the black community. Even if you just look at BLM, right? $90 million in 1 year, up to $10 billion altogether, in the hands of a very small group of black feminists. Well, who are they going to extend those resources to? What organizations, what agendas are going to be pushed? And yet, we've not heard of anything pushed by this organization that's actually benefited the primary group being killed most: heterosexual black males. So I argue that this venture has been created to create a new buffer class, a buffer class that's highly educated, again, due to a whole nother era of options made available to one demographic, one gender in our community, and not the other. Black women went to college since the 1970s, black men went to prison. And so by the time you get to 2015, this new dynamic of funded activism is laying on top of an older one of bifurcated incarceration, which leads us to an even further rift in the quality of life between black men and women, and most particularly a new buffer class led by educated women who now have resources alongside an education, and they tend to be more consistently employed, at least up till COVID, right? They're in a situation now where they're able to leverage resources to specific agendas that suit their interests. Well, what interests are they going to suit? If they've already been willing to appropriate black male deaths for their own agenda and not actually advocate for policy that stems those deaths or even acknowledge publicly that it's black men who are the primary focus of racist ire, if they're not willing to do that, what are they going to do with $90 million or $10 billion? Right? So it says so to continue. We want to uplift black joy and liberation, not just black death. We want to see black communities thriving, not just surviving, reads an impact report the foundation shared with AP before releasing it. Now, this is the same group that talked about on their website until recently when they removed it, that they were standing for the black family, which seemed to include everybody but black men. Right? We couldn't even be present in families. But now they're going to talk about black joy and liberation and not just black death. They haven't even acknowledged who's dying, and now they're not going to talk about black death anymore. They want to focus on joy. All right, interesting. This marks the first time in the movement's nearly 8-year history that BLM leaders have revealed a detailed look at their finances. The foundation's coffers and influence grew immensely following the May 2020 death of George Floyd, a black man whose last breaths under the knee of a white Minneapolis police officer sparked protests across the U.S. and around the world. That growth also caused long-standing tensions to boil over between some of the movement's grassroots organizers and national leaders. The former went public last fall with grievances about financial transparency, decision-making, and accountability. The foundation said it committed $21.7 million in grant funding to official and unofficial BLM chapters, as well as 30 black-led organizations, black-led local organizations. It ended 2020 with a balance of more than $60 million after spending nearly a quarter of its assets on the grant funds and other charitable giving. Now understand, we talk about grants. This is the dissemination process where those resources are being given to very specific groups, which is an extension, right, of an agenda. It's an extension of a worldview. In other words, when you have those resources, you target them to groups that you want to extend your worldview with, right? And if black men are not even allowed to lead within the organization to any great capacity, what then does that mean when you start disseminating grants to local chapters? Okay. In its report, the BLM Foundation said individual donations via its main fundraising platform averaged $30.76. More than 10% of the donations were recurring. The report does not state who gave the money in 2020, and leaders declined to name prominent donors. Interesting. Last year, the foundation's expenses were approximately $8.4 million. That included staffing, operating, and administrative costs, along with activities such as civic engagement, rapid response, and crisis intervention. Still, the BLM 10 members said reality didn't match the picture movement founders were projecting around the world. In its early years, BLM disclosed receiving donations from A-list celebrities such as Beyonce, Jay-Z, and Prince prior to his death in 2016. Shout out to Prince. Still jarred about that. Anyway, leaders at the BLM Foundation admit that they have not been clear about the movement's finances and governance over the years, but now the foundation is more open about such matters. It says the fiscal sponsor currently managing its money requires spending be approved by a collective action fund, which is a board made up of representatives from the official BLM chapters. Right? After Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, the surge of donations saw the foundation go from a small, scrappy movement to a maturing institution. So basically, if you had an organization where men can't lead in any significant fashion, especially heterosexual men, and you're now going to set up a board which is going to oversee spending, again, how does that impact black men? Well, one impact we can find actually comes in a recent article, came out a couple days ago, and this you can find in yahoo.com, on yahoo.com. It's entitled Mike Brown's Father, Ferguson Organizers, Request $20 million from BLM. Tory Russell, co-founder of the International Black Freedom Alliance, and Mike Brown Sr. have requested the funding for their community. Mike Brown Sr. and local community organizer Tory Russell demanded BLM provide $20 million to continue their work in Ferguson, Missouri. Russell, who co-founded the International Black Freedom Alliance, appears next to Brown Sr. in a video expanding on their official statement. The IBFA released a series of images and videos via Twitter that clarifies their mission and their reasoning for asking BLM to provide the money. All right? So this is interesting. It's letting us know how this agenda tends to work, who it benefits, who it doesn't, who has access, who doesn't, and to what extent. Right? All right. So it says, let's see. According to the Twitter thread, Brown Sr. has only received $500 from any BLM affiliated group since his son's 2014 killing, despite being a community figure who organizes and supports other families in healing and empowerment. The demand is in response to news. You know what? Hold the fuck up. The man got $500. Do you understand? Right? So recent reports suggest that up to $10 billion has been extended to BLM-like groups, the majority and lion's share of that going to BLM as an individual organization. But the father of the gentleman of this era's Emmett Till, Mike Brown, right? The father who organized his own grassroots organization not long after Mike Brown was killed has only gotten $500 from the organization who built its movement on the death of his son. That incenses me. It's ridiculous that black men keep dying and these people are profiting off of it, and the man can't. The demand is in response to news of BLM receiving over $90 million in response to the uprisings launched after the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others. On behalf of many activists in the St. Louis area, I'm joined by Mike Brown Sr., the father of Mike Brown Jr. Today, we hold Black Lives Matter accountable, Russell announced in the video. You know, a colleague of mine on Facebook, she sent me an image of a response that she got from the NAACP. And shout out to her. I won't reveal her name here because I didn't get her permission to do so, but she sent me this because she was interested in showing me how internal to these organizations, how this gender dynamic is playing out and how they're seeing themselves even. So this was a response she got from the NAACP. Who runs the world? Black women. It's no secret that black women are the backbone of our society, but history and archaic policies have rarely treated us as such. This month, in celebration of Women's History Month, we're doubling down on our advocacy to uplift black women who uplift this country day after day. Now, remember, in terms of Black History Month, organizations like Google and YouTube and others began to frame this year's Black History Month as Black Women's History, and now we're transitioning into Women's History Month, and that's apparently still for black women. So black men don't exist. You know, we just, we're invisible. So all we do is die, and they build movements in our honor. And as I've said in previous shows, the ways in which black men show up for protest may be different because we have a different relationship with the state, but they go ignored. Black men don't protest the way black women do. And that doesn't mean we don't engage in activism. We just don't have the same access to a secure reality. In other words, and I've talked to women who do this, they'll talk about, I'm going to go get arrested today, and then I'm going to take the kids to, dinner, and then I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to go do that, but I'm going to get arrested, right, at a protest. And this was a few years ago, but, I'm listening to this, and I'm like, I don't know black men who can make that gamble, who can do that, knowing full well that they'll get out by 5 o'clock. I've met brothers who've gone in over traffic tickets, and it took a month to get out. Because even something like protecting themselves in prison or in jail cost them time. And by the time they got out, they lost apartments, they lost jobs, they lost girlfriends, you name it. And that's if they got out. So that's not a luxury black men have. So we engage in activism in different ways because we have a different quality of life. Yet, all of that tends to go ignored now, and now we're having conversations about how black women are the backbone of the black community. Okay. The message goes on. From the fight for a $15 minimum wage to the development of the coronavirus vaccine, black women continue to push this country forward. The development of, don't get me started. How the hell did that happen? Anyway, yet we suffer the brunt of the structural inequities embedded into our nation's systems, and friend, it's about time that we right that wrong. So this is not BLM. This is the NAACP, right? These are, see, this is the thing. When you're talking about electoral representation in terms of politicians, when you talk about activist organizations like NAACP or BLM, many of them depend on education. Right? This is one of the reasons that we're seeing, so many black women coming into electoral positions over black men. It's coming back to education, right? Black men aren't even graduating high school to the same degree black women are, let alone going to college, right? So this is having an impact, right? Because you have black women with degrees and white collar jobs, and they're transitioning into all these dynamics. They're transitioning into entrepreneurship, they're transitioning into activism, so on and so forth. And their education is a key factor in that dynamic. But what we're also finding is that in this, mono kind of view, the singular view of the world, we're finding that women are primarily getting into positions where they primarily advocate for other women. And to the extent that men are involved, we're involved in terms of our deaths, not necessarily involved in terms of, the organizing around it and what happens, and the use and decision making regarding philanthropic dollars, right? So here you have Michael Brown Sr. actually having to demand resources from the organization that benefited most from his son's death, only having received $500, right, so far. Black men are not even conceptualized as part of the movement, and yet at every protest I see them regularly, right? As an interesting aside, what I tend to notice is the police don't even show up in riot gear unless half the protesters are male. And it's not necessarily that they're coming with guns or anything of that nature, but they're watched very closely. When they show up in least in half numbers, the police show up in riot gear. So we are watched. Our presence does change the dynamic, but somehow there's no credit extended for what we do. And I recently reported on a professor and an economist who was actually pushing for women's contributions to be monetized and quantified. No such conversation for men. People can't even readily tell you how black men engage in protest, right, or in activism, because they measure it based on women's methods. But men can't use black women's methods because we live a different reality and we have a different relationship with the state, let alone the police. So that said, I just wanted to kind of highlight this in terms of what we're seeing from this organization that has appropriated so much from black male death and given really very little back, aside from symbolic representation, while at the same time maximizing on a structural level, right, their position and using philanthropic dollars to do so, to establish the positionality of black women at the expense and the absence of black men. And that was assured several years ago when black men were told, you have no significant place in the movement. And I even have articles up on my blog, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, where they talked about BLM was not for black men, it was for black women. This is coming from one of the founders of the organization, right? So when I talk about the creation of a new buffer class, when I talk about the development of a new deal, but just for black women, that's what I mean. Financed philanthropically at first, more than likely to be financed federally when we start talking about policies pushed by BLM that only primarily focus on black women and girls. What we're seeing is the development of a new class of highly educated women, and not men, not their husbands, not their fathers, not their sons. They are pretty much invisible. You make that make sense. I see it as a divide and conquer, but the problem with that is when you have a divide and conquer dynamic in place and the people that benefit in your community from that divide and conquer don't want to give up those benefits to call out the injustice of how half their demographic, half their community is being treated, well, what do you call it then? I call it a coup, but that's just me. All right, y'all. Peace.